My talk starts with welcome everybody to the post-lunch slump. I'm Angie McKeown, you're in conference room 1, and today I have a poorly disguised talk about how much I like big robot suits, masquerading as something about securing your privileged accounts. We also refer to them as privileged identities, so if you hear me saying that, means the same thing. Like you, I'm also disappointed that I'm not getting to hear Neil McCallum's VR talk. So if in 10 minutes you feel like this is not quite right for you, sneak out the back, go and listen to him. Jobs are good. Okay, so what are we going to cover? So this is more of a strategy talk. I'm going to start with the basics, and we're going to think through what a privileged account really is, why we should even care, how we secure them, the kind of common obstacles that we've come across with customers, and then like 3 things, it might be more than 3 now, a few things you can go and do now to do some stuff in your environment. So before we get into that, who am I? Why am I standing here? I'm a security architect at Microsoft and one of the CTO teams. I currently focus on identity security in Azure. Azure's the Microsoft cloud. And I need to point out, of course, that this talk is all my stupid opinions and they're not my employers. A few years back, hold on, click the slide, Angie. A few years back, I did the Applied Cybersecurity Masters at Queen's. Before that, I had all sorts of jobs. I owned a tea company, I was an app developer, I worked in the Dyslexia Association. In 1996, I actually owned an internet cafe. So I've been in and out of tech for quite a long time. And one of the really interesting things about joining Microsoft now is much bigger than anything I've been in before, both internally and the size of the customers. And it just affects everything, like from the decisions that get made right the way down to how things roll out and processes happen. So that's been a really interesting adjustment. I'm also super keen on community stuff. I'm a massive fan of meetups. I'm currently involved in InfoSec NI, which is the community counterpart to the more sort of industry-focused NI Cyber. I just believe that community is the bedrock of industry in terms of accessibility of learning, developing contacts in the industry, and supporting people as they navigate through the industry. And it just really stops people falling through the cracks. So I really believe if you invest in community stuff, everybody comes out stronger. So it's really cool to be here today and see how much the dev conference has gone from strength to strength. I'm on Twitter a lot, but it's a personal account, so I tweet a lot of weird stuff, not just security. But if you're there too, today I invite you to tweet me photos of mechs so that I have more pretty mechs to go and look at. And finally, I think I'm going to have to say I'm probably going to run a little bit over time. So I will be in the bar later if you have any questions though. And I also have a wee bit of face blindness, so I haven't seen you in a couple of years. Pre-COVID, it's not that I've forgotten you, it's just that I don't recognize you anymore. Stay high anyway. Okay, so what's a privileged account? The engineering answer is probably it depends. So there is a technical answer though. Things like local admin, domain admin, Exchange or SharePoint admins, and not just admin accounts, also like service accounts have various privileges over the operating system, and your database accounts and your storage accounts all have much fuller access to data than normal users do. But if you ask someone else, maybe they'll tell you a privileged account is what they use to work on payroll, or it's how they upload their code to production. They don't really care about the technical scope of it underneath, and why should they? It's just there to enable their work. So our definition of a privileged account isn't always domain admin or something where people would, of course, say, duh, of course that needs to be separated off and secured. Sometimes it's just Jack from accounting, and I think it's important not to lose sight of that. And so right at the beginning here, I'm just trying to make the point that this isn't about the deep technical weeds of privileged admin accounts, because you can go and Google that stuff. This is about how to secure them in a way that works for your organization and works for the staff there. Because as you'll see, it's going to cause some disruption, and we're going to have to convince folks both upstream and downstream that they should play along. So let's take a moment and think about where we came from and why we have accounts at all. So lots of us started out on things like the Spectrum or the Amstrad or the Amiga, and you didn't have an account. You just plugged it in the wall and maybe you had a boot disk and away you went. Then we moved to Macs or PCs, and they had a rudimentary user account, but support for multiple users was pretty unstable for home machines. And of course, your user was pretty much always root or admin, whatever you were doing. And maybe now you're in business or you're in academia, your account is way more locked down, and that's really normal. You maybe can't install new programs, you can't use the USB ports, something like that. But your IT team can log in and do that stuff because they've got more privileged accounts. And so now also we have this notion that our accounts are not attached to just one machine. There's something that we can log into from other devices as well because of our account settings, and our privileges are all stored somewhere central, possibly in the cloud. And that also brings its own problems because now it isn't just about what we're authorized to do. It puts the focus back on authentication of how exactly we're proving who we say we are. So that is to say, the point of having user accounts at all is to determine two things. Authentication, when you put in your credentials, are you who you're claiming to be? And authorization, what are you specifically allowed to do in this system? So the answer to our original question is that any account which is allowed to do more stuff than normal is privileged. Because from an attacker perspective, even those less obvious privileged accounts can still do some unexpectedly heavy damage when they're not used as intended. So why should you care? Well, because breaches are where the kaiju come through. I mean, this is the obligatory security industry slide that says, look, there's been a lot of breaches this year, and they were mostly from credential stealing, and small businesses got hit too, and the fines are really bad, man. And it's all really well researched and reported on. So if you need convinced that security is somewhat necessary, I don't think you'd be sitting here. A report from our compromise recovery team from last year showed that across all the customers that we provided compromise recovery services for, 98% of them had provisioned excessive admin credentials. So that increased their attack surface. And 92% of them had no MFA on their admin accounts. So the bar is pretty low for doing something about this stuff. We've also, if you've been paying any attention, there's been a whole bunch of insider threat stuff this year. The fun lapsus attacks, where people were buying credentials for literally just buying them from employees. Or using MFA fatigue, that's quite an interesting new behavior where you continually try to log in and the person gets so many MFA prompts at such weird hours of the day, and they just keep coming, and eventually they click the button and they say, yeah, sure, it is me, go on ahead. And so those kind of things are really, really hard to secure against, unless we start looking at monitoring and behavioral analytics. Talk to me in the bar later about the tension between that and privacy. But anyway, Jack in payroll, he doesn't care about that stuff. All that security stuff is someone else's problem. And Anna just wants to deploy her code quickly the way she always has. She's pretty narc that they don't trust her anymore with admin credentials. And she's already overworked. So she's probably going to throw as many spanners in the works as possible to delay or derail the whole privileged identity thing. It's not working for her. And Brad's the vice president. So Brad reckons maybe it's just cheaper to pay the fines than to spend the time and money on all this security nonsense. And why should he give up his admin access? Because he's one of the most important people in the business. So that's kind of what we're about here, is a strategy on how we can secure our privileged accounts despite the kind of resistance that we're going to get. So it's essentially a change management problem when you boil it down. And I've seen time and time again from customers that they're pretty well able to set up all of the technical bits and bobs. But without the right organizational preparation and follow through, they really struggle to make it stick. And that's where my mech analogy comes in, or falls flat on its face. I'll let you decide, I'm not sure. Giant robot admins! Okay, so mechs are not technically robots. It's more like a robotic suit that a human operator is a pilot in. But anyway, I like to think of all of the privileged accounts in the org as a fleet of mech suits, and they're all different designs and they're all different abilities, and they're all varying degrees of powerful and destructive. And so they're only really meant for doing admin tasks, but they could wreak absolute havoc if they were misused. And so you only want your human pilots to jump into them and use them if you've checked. They really are who they say they are, like they haven't just carded in with someone else's ID, that they're authorized to be in that mech or that admin account, that they're kind of trained to use it safely, and that the access that they have is just in time. So just in time is when you don't have permanent permissions. You just request your privileges to be elevated when you need them, only for a short amount of time. Maybe you'll ask them to provide a bit of a business justification whenever they request their access. And if it's a particularly important admin account, maybe someone more senior has to approve their little excursion. You also want to be able to revoke their access when that becomes appropriate. So you need to go back and look and say, does this person still need all of this access? Are they still even with the company? And finally, you kind of want there to be a little bit of a black box recorder for what they did while they were in there. And these things are all commonly controlled in all different clouds with identity and access management policies. So for an Azure, for example, you can use privileged identity management, which is PIM for short, and you can use conditional access policies to control and to automate these things. And I'm not an expert in GCP or AWS, but I'm sure they've got similar policy controls. And hopefully it's also obvious that things like MFA or approvals can only be used for human accounts. If you have privileged workload identities like apps or services, they can still be secured with conditional access though. So we all know you can't go into battle without a plan. And to my mind, there's 4 phases to securing your privileged accounts. First, clean up whatever's already there and lay out your policy decisions and your scope. Then carry out the technical implementation, land your changes successfully, and then put some maintenance in place. So, laying aside the debate on whether Robocop counts as a mech or not, let's talk about the cleanup and planning. Security's golden rule is that before you try to secure anything, you enumerate it to see what you have. And there are tools for this. Entra Permissions Management helps discovering over-permissioning in your Azure environments. I think it's cross-cloud as well, actually. It works for users and for workload identities. There's also features inside PIM and inside Office 365 Admin Center and Intune that will identify people who have admin access. Or if you don't have all the fancy licensing, there's publicly available PowerShell scripts that you can run in your environment. And of course, we want to go through and deprivilege some of those people and remove as much standing admin access as possible. Not that popular, but it needs to be done. This one's also not that popular, separation of duties. So I frequently hear customers asking, do we really need to do that? There's no way Microsoft has different accounts for all their admins, but we really do. The old style of doing things was to just have shared accounts for everything. Just this week, I heard about a firm that I won't name, where someone got moved to an admin role and they got their shiny new account. And the first thing they did with their new account was change their password, which seems pretty fair to me. And then they spent the whole day fielding complaints because everyone sharing that admin account had lost access and couldn't do their work. And it would shock you the size of the companies. It would shock you. And you may also remember a few years ago that Nadine Dorris publicly admitted all of her staff shared an account. And she was saying that in defense of the Secretary of State because he was accused about looking at porn on his work machine. And they were trying to make the point that it could easily have been an intern because the account was shared. So separation of accounts is not just a security issue. It goes a long way towards accountability and liability. And if you can prove who did or didn't do something, then there's a chance you can head off a PR disaster. So we don't want to be sharing accounts. Now, once we've come up with those plans, we kind of want to categorize and standardize what kind of access levels we want going forward. So not everybody knows whose access needs what. So this is usually a multi-team discussion, and it's not usually that simple. In a big org, though, it's a really, really important step. We want to know what's going to be assigned to administrative users, and that maybe there's some people who can have admin access with their personal account because the admin access is very low. Which ones are really high impact admin accounts, and so we're going to isolate those off on their own. Which accounts are going to be shared across multiple users. And we also want break glass emergency accounts for when everything all goes badly and you need to emergency log in with something that isn't controlled by all these policies, because maybe something has happened to Azure or something has happened to your policies or something has happened somewhere that you need a break glass account to get in with. And you want probably different policies for external users. So we suggest that you try to standardize the policies between high, medium, and low impact roles. And that way, all of your different teams aren't just winging it, and you can have some consistency between the policies for similar roles. And we also recommend that you have absolutely zero permanently active admins. So for the deployment approach, we're going to say probably prioritize deployment in a few phases. The most critical things need to be protected first, right? So first of all, you definitely want to go in and protect all of your critical Azure AD roles, your global admins, all those kind of things. Then you can expand to the remaining roles. And then eventually, I guess you could add your Azure resource admins as well. And your plan should also include any integrations that you're going to need to include. So you can have a third-party identity provider. You can hook into Workday or other HR systems as part of the proof that people are who they say they are. And you can also govern on-prem databases and LDAP and security groups from Azure AD. So some of the integrations already have pre-existing connectors, but I also want to highlight, like, if they don't already, learning to use and build logic apps and workflows is a massive time investment for large orgs. It's a really, really good idea to do, because once you start to be able to build your own workflows for things, it automates so much. I'm going to give you an example. This is the most boring slide in the deck. So this is what I mean when I say some predefined settings for the high impact roles. So we're looking at things like, when a high impact role comes along, are we going to require MFA? Are alerts going to fire? Is a ticket going to be created? Do users need to first be marked as eligible in order to be able to request the elevated privileges? And things like maximum durations, like if people need to log in occasionally and do a little bit of work, let's not have them in the system for 8 hours. So there's lots of best practice guides for how to handle the actual technical bits. I don't think there's a point in covering them in depth, but here's some of the main ones. Please, for the love of God, turn on multi-factor authentication for admins. Back to that compromise recovery statistic. There are arguments to be made, sure, about MFA fatigue and text-based MFA not being secure enough and all of that, but accounts with no MFA are less secure than both those things. So there's a growing range of options for MFA. And you can also use single sign-on, right, which helps alleviate a little bit that burden. Single sign-ons when you successfully use MFA when you first sign in, and then that trusted authentication is passed along to the other things you're trying to sign into, so you don't have to keep redoing it all the time. Conditional access is really cool because it does things like, hey, you can only get in if you're coming from a certain device or a certain location, or your client app's on the allow list. And if they're not, then you can either block access completely, or you can also say, well, you can still log in, but only if you do MFA again to prove it's really you. And you can also set that to just report, which I'll talk about in a bit. We also want very much to, in these admin accounts, to remove email and web access. So, I mean, you basically want to remove access to anything that's not needed for that role. Your admin accounts shouldn't be receiving email, and they shouldn't need to use the web. And we already know that 2 of the main ways that attackers gain access is by phishing emails or bad downloads. And so just remove those options. If you want to delve into more details about what else you should remove and how you shouldn't cross things over, have a wee look at the enterprise access model. You can also use role-based access controls. And so you can say the Exchange admin can only do things related to Exchange when they're logged in. You can also utilize passwordless. So you can use FIDO keys, you can use Windows Hello for Business, you can use an authenticator app, and that's possible even with a third-party IDP. And the passwordless idea ties a little bit into this next point about PAWs. So a PAW is a privileged access workstation. And it's a completely separate, completely clean, hardened workstation that folks log into specifically to carry out stuff with highly sensitive or impactful admin accounts. And the reason is because of the way passwords and tokens and certificates and stuff are stored in the machine you log into. So if you log into your super secretive, sensitive admin account and you just do it on your normal little crappy terminal, some of those login details will end up stored there. And then if an attacker is able to compromise your regular terminal, then they can pull all of that other stuff from it. Now, it's still not an easy attack, but if it's a very sensitive account and you have a completely different privileged access workstation, that sorts that problem out because you'll have never logged into the admin account from any other place. So, I mean, you'd be forgiven for looking at all this though and thinking, looks like a bit of a pain in the arse for the user. And that's another reason I like the mechs analogy. So it isn't just one and done. Running all of this stuff takes work. You don't fix up your privileged accounts one time and then that's it all sorted, sadly. It's a bit of an ongoing process, and the process, it needs some owners and it needs some maintenance. So your admins are going to need some guidance on how and when to use their admin accounts and what they should avoid doing while they're in them. And depending on the size of your org, maybe engineering's handled by several identity teams or the IT team, and then they need to agree communal guidance. And, you know, perhaps you've got your very own Mr. Scott desperately holding the warp core together almost single-handedly. Whatever it is, you need to understand that the maintenance tasks have to happen. They need some kind of regular cadence and they need some accountability. So the mech analogy, I think, does 3 things. It instills a little bit of a sense of respect for the admin account. It helps you give a good feeling about the importance of maintenance activities, even though they're a little boring. And it hopefully makes folks feel faintly ridiculous for wanting standing access to be in the big robot suits all day, every day. So we land the changes. Some teams are more effective than others. For your pilot phase, I shouldn't have used the word pilot now because I've just talked about pilots. For your proof of concept, choose people who are keen. Try and get the people who are led already by a really good communicator and spend some time enthusing them, because the way that they take it on will affect every team that gets it after them. So ProSci is a really mature change management framework, and they did a whole bunch of in-depth research about how people reacted to change and how they accept change in the organization. And they discovered that people want to know why we're changing it all, from the high-level executives. And from their managers, they want to know, okay, but how does the change affect me and what support am I going to get to do it? And so I guess you need to tailor your communications a little bit to account for those things as well. If a phase deployment makes sense in your org, then each phase usually has quite different stakeholders. And you might want to even prepare different slide decks and agree on a pilot for each phase. And that's because quite often the teams are so different and they might have a different communication style. They've got different anxieties about it. We really want to get them on board. I know that seems finicky, but it really pays dividends in adoption later, and it reduces the chance of shadow IT later. And of course, collect feedback from the first pilots to make adjustments to the subsequent ones. Put some maintenance in place. So And I'm really glad I did this slide deck because I've discovered this game in the course of the research. So I'm going to go and play that. Anyway, access reviews. We need to evaluate who still needs the ability to elevate their privileges. So in Azure, you can automate this in the tooling, and you can control whether folks can review their own access and say, yeah, I still need it, or no, I'm done with that now. Or you can assign access reviews to a third party. The tool will also make suggestions based on their usage data. So if somebody's saying, yeah, I still need access, I still need it, but the usage data says that they haven't used it at all in the last 3 months, well, the tool's going to give you a recommendation based on that. But look, it doesn't need to be fancy. This could be as simple as every 6 months this pops up in someone's calendar to go and look at. In terms of monitoring and auditing, just send all of your logs to Log Analytics. I mean, you don't have to start with a big Splunk or Sentinel or something. Just, you know, even if you just send all of your sign-in and non-interactive sign-in logs, they're good for hunting over. There are some really great workbooks all over GitHub available for all of this stuff. And of course, use Azure Monitor on your break glass accounts, because your break glass accounts, remember, are ones that are kind of outside of these systems. In case the systems break, then nobody should ever, 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 ever be logging into those. So you need a great big alert if someone does. Whenever we publish new roles to Azure, they get auto-assigned ownership for whoever owns privileged identity management. So you're also going to need a process in place to deal with reassigning those and documenting that transfer. And someone needs to be responsible for slotting them into that categories and standards that you came up with earlier, and making sure that the permissions are sized accordingly. And then, of course, you probably also want triggers in place for joiners, movers, and leavers. So, I mean, maybe these are just additions to manual checklists that you maintain for your procedures when someone joins or leaves. Or maybe they're logic apps. We have new lifecycle workflows that's just gone into public preview. And I think that helps to automate some of the joiner, mover, leaver stuff, but don't ask me about it because I haven't looked yet. So this is common obstacles from chatting to customers about deploying all of this. A big one is they really want to wait until everything's mapped and planned precisely so that they know exactly what they're going to do. And so they wait till they've pinned down, the teams have all argued, they've pinned down and categorized every last detail of identity, and sometimes their 12-month plan to revamp their identity security turns into a breach because it took them too long. It's a much better idea to run in phases. Immediately clean up the global admins and the critical accounts, and then work on the rest incrementally. Multiple stakeholders thing happens so often, it's actually painful. The solution to having multiple teams with opinions is to have a really strong sponsor actively engaged in the project that can make calls on all of this stuff and is good at influencing things to move forward. Other stuff like cutting too much too soon. This is the bit where instead of blocking things outright, you can set it to report. So for a few weeks, you can look at the reports coming in and you can say, Bob, you need to do that a wee bit differently because that's not within the procedure now, whatever. And don't turn on blocking until people are sort of ready for it. I need to wrap up. Okay, things you can go and do now. So we've kind of covered them already, but you go and turn on MFA for your admin accounts. If you do nothing else, please. Clean up your legacy access. Block legacy authentication. Okay, nobody should be using this, but holy smokes, definitely not your admins. And do a wee bit of work with separation of duties. And that's the thing where Bob has his personal account, but he also has his admin account. But don't just do the technical part of that. You need to help people understand why that's important. Identity protection. So I can't talk. I don't have time to talk about the Azure specific stuff. Identity protection is like conditional access on steroids. I love it. You should talk to me about that later. And this is my final thought. Security as an end state just doesn't exist. It's constantly evolving. And sure, it's technical settings and permissions and suspicion and process change and monitoring and all those audits and all those other things layered up that get in the way of your day job, or that they pay teams of people to come in and implement. And your developers and your executives like their old workflows, and they're faster with their old workflows. So security is a really difficult sell. It costs money and time. And unless you do the work for the org change, it's a tough journey with ambiguous business outcomes. What were you doing it for anyway then? So take some time to realize that the threat model for your business and for your industry isn't necessarily the same as anyone else's. Don't prioritize securing things that the business doesn't care about because it's just because it seems to be a fancy new attack. Reduce your risk in areas that actually matter. And get people asking, how could this get screwed up? Start to have abuser stories as well as user stories. And people are human, and they're forgetful, and they're full of emotions, and they cave to pressure. So you can go a long way to securing things just by bringing everyone along on that journey about thinking differently. So give them the vision of themselves in the giant mechs so that they remember to treat the admin accounts carefully. And give them the vision of the mech wrangling on the engineering floor so that the upkeep tasks don't fall by the wayside as much. Join the mech revolution. And with that, I've been Angie McKeown. You've been lovely. Thank you for listening.